You know, if you were to print out a transcript of like a really heated internet argument today,
Oh, yeah.
say a massive multi-thread fight in a comment section about politics or trigger warnings or just the younger generation destroying traditional
Right. Or
values.
the older generation hoarding wealth and ruining the economy. The classics.
Exactly, the
Yeah.
classics. And if you scrubbed away all the modern slang, the hashtags, and the specific news references from that transcript, you'd be left with a very distinct blueprint.
A blueprint of pure, unadulterated generational rage.
Yeah, exactly.
And stripped of the aesthetics of the 21st century, the underlying architecture of those arguments is remarkably, almost terrifyingly consistent. It's the eternal grinding friction between the established order and the disruptive new guard.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a story of human beings trying to share the same physical space while living in entirely different psychological universes.
And if I asked you, or, our listener, to guess when that blueprint was drawn up, you might think it was yesterday. Maybe birthed by some social media algorithm designed to make us all angry at our parents or our kids. But the most accurate, most devastatingly precise map of this exact culture war wasn't drawn up in Silicon Valley.
No, it wasn't.
It was mapped out in Russia in the middle of the 19th century.
It is a staggering realization for anyone who encounters it. I mean, you open a piece of literature published over 160 years ago, and you find your own Thanksgiving dinner table arguments staring right back at you, almost word for word.
It really is wild. So, welcome to the deep dive. To you, the listener, whether you are dealing with generational divides in your own family, navigating political polarization at the office, or just trying to make sense of a world that feels completely overwhelmed by shifting values and endless information, today's mission is custom built for you.
Absolutely.
We are unpacking Ivan Turgenev's masterpiece, Fathers and Sons, which is sometimes translated as Fathers and Children. We're going to explore the actual birth of the nihilist as a cultural archetype, examine the anatomy of a culture war, and see what happens when cold, radical intellect collides with undeniable, messy human emotion.
And we're going to do this by looking not just at the original text, but through the lens of literary historians and critics.
Like William Dean Howells.
Yeah, Howells, Maurice Baring, and Kay Woloszewski, who help us understand the absolute firestorm this story caused when it first dropped into the world.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the shouting matches and the heartbreak of the story itself, I want to understand the man holding the pen. Because you can't really understand a profound observation without knowing where the observer is standing.
That's very true.
So who was Ivan Turgenev? What was his world actually like?
Well, I understand Turgenev. You have to understand the sheer scale and the absolute rigidity of the world he was born into.
Okay.
Ivan Sergeyevich Turgenev was born in 1818 in the province of Orel, which is quite a bit south of Moscow. And he came from an old, established stock of Russian nobility.
So very well.
Incredibly wealthy. He grew up on a massive family estate called Spasko. Now, we have to pause here and define what it really meant to own a massive estate in Russia in the early 19th century. This was the era of serfdom.
Right. And when we say serfdom, we aren't just talking about, underpaid farmhands.
Not at all. I mean, serfdom in Russia was essentially a system of bondage where millions of peasants were legally tied to the land.
Wow.
And by extension, they were tied to the landowners. They could be bought, sold, traded, or punished at the absolute whim of the nobility.
That is dark.
Yeah. Turgenev's family literally owned the land and the people who lived and worked on it. His father was a military general, a veteran of the 1812 war against Napoleon, but it was actually his mother who ruled the estate.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The biographical notes we have describe her as a tyrannical woman with an absolutely ungovernable temper.
So he grows up in this environment of immense privilege, but also immense cruelty and arbitrary power.
Precisely. He witnesses firsthand the absolute authority of the older generation, not just over their children, but over human lives.
Right.
And his mother was fiercely ambitious for him. She mapped out a brilliant, high-ranking official career for him in the Russian bureaucracy. But Turgenev had a different temperament.
He wasn't into the bureaucracy.
Oh, not at all. When he decided he wanted to pivot to literature and abandon the Ministry of the Interior, his mother didn't just express mild disappointment.
What did she do?
She cut off his allowance entirely.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, forcing this wealthy young nobleman to suddenly figure out how to support himself.
That's a brutal reality check. But before that financial cutoff, he did receive an incredible education, right? I know he studied in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but the sources we're looking at put a massive emphasis on his time in Berlin.
They do.
Why was Berlin such a turning point for him?
What's fascinating here is the specific intellectual diet Turgenev consumed while studying in Berlin. In the 1830s and 40s, Berlin was the absolute epicenter of radical philosophical thought in Europe.
Yep.
As the critic Wojciechowski points out in his analysis, Turgenev arrived in Berlin precisely when the young Hegelians were tearing down traditional systems of thought.
Okay, wait, I've heard the term Hegelian, but break that down for me. What are these guys actually arguing that is so radical?
Well, let's look at a couple of the key figures Turgenev absorbed.
Right.
You have philosophers like Bruno Bauer.
Right.
And Bauer was essentially laying it down as a strict dogma that no truly educated man ought to hold fixed opinions or beliefs on any subject.
None at all.
None. It was the absolute worship of critical negation. And then even more extreme, you have Max Stirner. Stirner wrote a book called The Ego and Its Own, and his argument was that literally every societal structure, religion, morality, laws, the concept of a nation, family duty, they're all just spooks.
Spooks.
Yeah, spooks. They're ghosts in your head.
Wait, so Stirner is telling 19 and 20-year-old university students that the entire fabric of human civilization is a hallucination, and the only real thing in the universe is them, like their own ego.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Stirner argued that the only tangible, undeniable reality is the individual ego and its immediate desires.
Man.
Right. Imagine feeding that philosophy to a generation of bright, restless young people who are looking at their own countries, especially the Russian youth, looking back at the backward, oppressive system of serfdom we just talked about and realizing they don't have to respect any of it.
That is intellectual dynamite. I mean, it's like someone wrote an entirely new operating system for the human brain.
Yes.
One that just deletes the files for religion, tradition, and art, and only leaves a very cold, calculating app running.
That's a brilliant way to put it. And Turgenev was sitting in Berlin watching this new operating system being installed in the minds of his peers. He watched the Russian youth studying abroad eagerly download this exact German philosophical diet.
Wow.
And this is crucial because this is the exact ideological framework he later builds into the young, radical characters of his novels.
Yeah.
He witnessed the ideological shift happening in real time.
So he absorbs all this. He eventually returns to Russia, and he starts writing. And he gains fame with a book called Sportsman's Sketches, which, as I understand it, are stories drawn from his time wandering the woods of his native province, hunting and interacting with the peasants.
That's right.
And it's beautifully written, but it actually gets him into serious trouble with the government.
It did. A Sportsman's Sketches humanized the serfs in a way that made the Russian government deeply uncomfortable.
Because they're supposed to just be property.
Exactly. Then, when he wrote a glowing obituary for the writer Gogol, whom the authorities viewed with suspicion, Turgenev was arrested.
Just for an obituary?
Yes. He was imprisoned for a month and kept under strict police surveillance at his country estate for 2 years.
Which gives us a very clear picture of the powder keg that was Russia in the 1850s. I mean, the state is terrified of ideas, but eventually the restrictions on him ease up. And a lot of that has to do with the broader historical context, right?
Yeah.
The Crimean War ends.
Yes. Russia suffered a humiliating defeat in the Crimean War in 1856. That defeat shattered the illusion of Russian military and bureaucratic supremacy. It proved that the old ways, the ways of the fathers, were fundamentally obsolete and broken.
Yeah.
The younger generation felt betrayed by the sheer incompetence of the older generation. It created a massive generational fracture.
And right as this fracture is widening, Turgenev basically leaves. He has money again, and he spends much of the rest of his life as a wanderer in Europe, like Paris, Baden-Baden.
Right.
And the sources mention he spent years essentially trailing after Pauline Viardot, a famous opera singer who was married to someone else.
He did. He was utterly devoted to her for the rest of his life. He essentially lived as an appendage to her family in Europe.
Okay, I have a major question about this, because Turgenev is hailed as this incredible objective observer of the Russian radical youth.
Yes.
But if he is a wealthy nobleman living in comfortable European exile, trailing after an unrequited or at least highly complicated romantic love,
I see where you're going.
Doesn't that make him exactly the kind of old-world romantic aristocrat that the radical youth wanted to destroy?
Yeah.
How can we trust his portrayal of these young radicals if he is fundamentally opposed to everything they stand for? Like, isn't he totally biased?
That is the defining paradox of Turgenev, and it's the exact question his contemporary critics asked. But the critics we are referencing today, like Woloszewski and William Dean Howells, argue that this contradiction is the very source of his genius.
Really? How so?
Woloszewski notes that Turgenev actually tried, on a few occasions, to write a purely fiery, heroic, revolutionary character, and he failed.
Huh.
He failed because Turgenev himself was far too dreamy, too gentle, too good-natured a being. He wasn't an agitator. He was an observer with a profound capacity for empathy.
So you're saying his distance, both physically in Europe and temperamentally, is what allowed him to see the whole board.
Exactly. Howells describes Turgenev as possessing the vast melancholy of the Slav, patient, agnostic, trustful. He had this incredibly subtle sympathy with human weakness. Turgenev couldn't write a one-dimensional villain or a flawless hero because he saw the tragic flaws in everyone, including himself and his own social class. He knew the aristocracy was doomed, but he also saw the terrifying coldness of the youth coming to replace them.
Okay, that makes sense. We have this dreamy, gentle observer sitting in a Parisian salon, looking back at Russia and watching the youth of his country radicalize themselves with cold, hard German materialism.
Yes.
And this tension perfectly sets the stage for the inciting incident of Fathers and Sons. The story begins on May 20th, 1859, and the opening scene is essentially a carriage ride that brings the new world crashing right into the driveway of the old world.
Let's set the scene. We open at a dusty posting station in the Russian provinces. Nikolai Petrovich Kirsanov is waiting.
Okay, and who is Nikolai?
He's a landowner in his early 40s. He's a widower. His hair is turning gray. He plays the violoncello. And he deeply loves the romantic poetry of Pushkin.
So he's a softie.
He really is. He is a gentle, somewhat timid man who is currently overwhelmed trying to implement new progressive reforms on his estate, but he doesn't quite know how to manage the peasants.
And he is waiting for his son, Arkady, who has just graduated from the university in St. Petersburg and is coming home.
Right.
And Nikolai is just so anxious and eager to see his boy. Finally, the carriage rolls up. Arkady jumps out. But he hasn't come alone. He's brought a friend from the university, Yevgeny Buzarov.
And Turgenev uses physical description instantly to establish the absolute collision of these two worlds. Nikolai is a polite, manicured gentleman. Buzarov is a medical student.
And he looks the part.
He does. He steps out of the carriage wearing a long, loose, rough coat with tassels. It's essentially a work garment, completely lacking in aristocratic elegance. He has a long, lean face, a broad forehead, large greenish eyes, sandy drooping whiskers, and long, thick hair.
The detail that really caught my eye in the source text is the handshake.
Oh, yes.
Nikolai warmly offers his hand to welcome his son's friend, but Buzarov doesn't take it immediately.
Right. Buzarov hesitates, and when he finally does offer his hand, Turgenev specifically notes that Buzarov's hand is red and ungloved.
Why is Turgenev pointing out the red hand? Is Buzarov just making a fashion statement by not wearing gloves?
It's much deeper than a fashion statement. It's a profound class and ideological signifier.
Okay.
In 1859, a Russian nobleman wore gloves to signify that he did not do manual labor. His hands were soft and pale. Buzarov's red, ungloved hand tells us immediately that he works with his hands. He is a man of science. He cuts up frogs. He handles chemicals.
Wow.
It is a physical manifestation of his refusal to abide by the delicate, useless rules of the aristocracy. He is completely unapologetic, exuding this tranquil, almost arrogant self-confidence.
And the friction sparks immediately. They get into the carriages to head to the estate. Buzarov gets in with Arkady, and right away Buzarov yells at Nikolai's peasant driver, calling him Bushy Beard.
Right.
Meanwhile, Arkady is trying so hard to impress his edgy friend. Arkady accepts a cheap, pungent black cigar from Buzarov and starts smoking it in the carriage. It fills the air with such a strong, acrid smell that poor Nikolai, riding next to them, has to subtly turn his head away so he doesn't cough and offend his son.
It's a brilliant, universally recognizable detail.
It really is. Arkady is behaving exactly like a college freshman coming home for the holidays.
Oh, totally.
You know the dynamic. They adopt the exact personality, the exact vocabulary, and even the bad habits of their incredibly intimidating, edgy upperclassman roommate. Arkady is desperate to signal to his father that he has outgrown the soft, poetic world he was raised in.
And the ultimate signal of this departure comes when they arrive at the estate. which is called Marino. They sit down, and Arkady proudly explains to his father and his uncle Pavel exactly what his friend Bazarov is.
Right.
He announces with immense pride and a touch of condescension that Bazarov is a nihilist.
Okay, we need to stop and really examine this word, nihilist. Turgenev didn't invent the word out of thin air. It comes from the Latin nihil, meaning nothing, but the way Turgenev uses it here, the way he applies it to a specific generational attitude, it absolutely exploded into the culture.
It did. It was like dropping a bomb into the Russian vernacular.
How exactly is it defined in this text?
It becomes the subject of immediate, intense debate at the dinner table. Uncle Pavel, who is the ultimate representative of the old guard, and whom we will analyze deeply in a moment, is bewildered. He asks what the word means.
Naturally.
And Arkady defines it like he's reading from a textbook. He says, a nihilist is a man who does not bow down before any authority, who does not take any principle on faith, whatever reverence that principle may be enshrined in.
It's that operating system update we talked about earlier. Wipe the hard drive of everything.
Exactly.
And Pavel, who believes in tradition, asks, well, and is that good? And Arkady gives this incredibly naive answer. Yeah, that depends, Uncle. Some people it will do good to, but some people will suffer for it.
But Bazarov isn't content to let Arkady speak for him. Bazarov pushes the definition much further.
He takes over.
He does. He says, I don't believe in anything. And what is science? Science in the abstract. There are sciences, as there are trades and crafts, but abstract science doesn't exist at all. Bazarov rejects art. He rejects poetry. He rejects romantic love. He rejects social traditions. And he even rejects philosophical abstractions about science. He believes only in what can be proven by biology, chemistry, and physics. 2 + 2 = 4. As he says, everything else is romantic rot.
It's so fascinating to read this because the dynamic is timeless.
Oh, absolutely.
To you listening, think about a time you tried to proudly explain a radical new concept to your parents. You come home, you drop some heavy academic jargon at the dinner table, fully expecting them to be awed by your enlightenment.
Right.
And instead, you're met with total bewilderment, or worse, mild amusement. Arkady thinks he is a nihilist, but he's really just a follower wearing the ideology like a new leather jacket.
Precisely. Arkady is mimicking the posture of rebellion. Bazarov, on the other hand, is the rebellion. He embodies it in his bones.
Yeah.
He is the prototype of the new youth. And while Nikolai, the father, tries to be accommodating and open-minded, he even humbly hopes Bazarov can give him advice on agricultural chemistry to help with the estate. His brother Pavel is a completely different story.
Very different.
Pavel is deeply, fundamentally offended by Bazarov's very existence.
And this collision brings us to the ideological centerpiece of the text, the anatomy of a culture war. The relentless verbal sparring matches between Pavel and Bazarov are the beating heart of this story. They are the immovable object and the unstoppable force.
Yes.
If we want to understand the architecture of this debate, we have to paint a clear picture of Pavel Petrovich Kirsanov. Who is the man sitting across the table from the nihilist?
Well, Pavel is a man deliberately living out of time. He is about 45 years old, fiercely handsome, with close-cropped silver hair. He is living deep in the Russian provinces, surrounded by muddy roads and peasant farms, yet he dresses as if he is stepping out of a high-society club in London.
It's wild.
He wears elegant English suits, fashionable low cravats, and kid leather shoes.
The sources specifically mention his exquisite hand with its long tapering pink nails and a snowy white cuff buttoned with a single big opal.
Right.
He smells of high-end European cologne. It's almost absurd. Bazarov takes one look at him and later says to Arkady, "Only fancy such style in the country. His nails, you ought to send them to an exhibition."
Yeah.
Bazarov thinks Pavel is an absolute joke. He literally calls him an antique survival.
But it would be a mistake to view Pavel merely as a foolish dandy. He is highly educated, highly cultivated, and he represents a deeply ingrained European aristocratic tradition.
He's not stupid.
No, not at all. He truly believes in civilization. He argues that a society cannot function without foundational principles. He defends the English model of aristocracy, which relies on duty and self-respect. And paradoxically, for a man in an English suit, he fiercely defends the sacred traditions of the Russian peasant specifically, the mir.
Okay, let's break that down. Because a modern reader might gloss over the word mir. What was it and why was it so sacred to Pavel?
The mir was the traditional Russian peasant village commune It was a deeply patriarchal collective system where the land was owned communally and periodically redistributed among the families.
Okay.
It was bound together by strong Orthodox religious faith and a reverence for the Tsar. For conservatives like Pavel, the mir was the mystical bedrock foundation of the Russian soul. He argues that the Russian people cannot live without faith and without these ancient patriarchal traditions.
And Bazarov just swats these arguments away like they are nothing.
He really does.
When Pavel brings up the sacred traditions of the peasants, Bazarov essentially says, so what? He tells Pavel, the people imagine that when it thunders, the prophet Ilya is riding across the sky in his chariot. What then? Are we to agree with them?
Right.
Bazarov dismisses the peasants' deep religious convictions as pathetic superstition. Yet, in the same breath, he claims he's more authentically Russian than Pavel because his grandfather actually plowed the land, whereas Pavel just sits around polishing his nails.
This ideological clash leads to a critical question, and it's one Pavel relentlessly pushes Bazarov to answer. Pavel asks, if you destroy all the institutions, the faith, the traditions, the art, what do you build in its place? How do you know what to build?
And Bazarov's answer is chilling.
It is. He says, that's not our business now.
Right?
The ground wants clearing first.
Ground wants clearing first. That is heavy.
It is the ultimate statement of nihilism. Bazarov declares that his generation's only mission is to destroy. He says, we act by virtue of what we recognize as beneficial. At the present time, negation is the most beneficial of all, and we deny everything.
I need to interject here because I'm struggling with Bazarov's logic, and I want to see if the text addresses this.
Yeah.
Sharov claims he doesn't believe in anything. He claims to be purely scientific, purely objective, just treating human society with the same emotional detachment he uses when dissecting frogs. But when he is debating Pavel, the text says his face gets this coarse coppery hue. He argues with intense, almost violent passion. If he truly believes in nothing, why is he so angry? Isn't his so-called nihilism actually a deeply held, zealous belief system in itself?
You've isolated the central contradiction of Bazarov's character, and it is the exact flaw that Turgenev weaves into him so brilliantly. Bazarov claims to be completely devoid of pride and emotion, yet his ego is immense.
Yeah.
He boasts about his grandfather being a plowman to score points against Pavel, but when he actually goes out and interacts with the peasants on the estate, he speaks to them with casual contempt. And ironically, the peasants view him not as a savior, but as a sort of educated buffoon.
Wow.
He claims to believe only in utility, arguing that a good chemist is 20 times more useful than any poet. But his burning desire to destroy society is fundamentally an emotional, almost romantic crusade. He is a fanatic of nothingness.
And Pavel calls him out on the terrifying danger of this fanaticism. Pavel warns that this isn't just a fun philosophical game to play at the university. He points out that Bazarov and his radical followers are just 4 men and a half, a tiny intellectual minority.
Right.
But they are messing with the minds of millions of people who hold these traditions sacred. Pavel warns that this brute force negation will rip the social fabric apart.
And Bazarov's retort to that warning is one of the most famous lines in the novel. He dismisses the idea that his small numbers mean he is powerless. He tells Pavel all Moscow was burnt down, by a farthing dip being a cheap, insignificant candle.
He's referring to the fire of Moscow in 1812, right, when the city burned to deny it to Napoleon.
Yes. But if we connect this to the broader historical reality, the foresight in Turgenev writing that single line in the early 1860s is absolutely staggering.
How so?
He is predicting the precise mechanism of the Russian Revolution that would occur decades later. The idea that a tiny, seemingly insignificant flame of radical negation, a small group of dedicated intellectuals could burn down the entire established order of a massive empire. Pavel represents the magnificent wooden civilization that is about to be burned. Bazarov represents the match.
That is just chilling. And while these two titans are clashing while the match is being struck, you have Nikolai, the gentle father, caught in the middle. There is this incredibly poignant, quiet moment in the text that perfectly crystallizes the tragedy of this culture war.
I know exactly the scene you mean.
It's evening. Nikolai is sitting alone in his garden, reading a poem by Pushkin and the Gypsies. He's just taking comfort in the beauty of the verse. Arkady walks up to him, sees what his father is reading, and with a look of kindly compassion, gently takes the book of poetry out of his father's hands.
Yeah.
And he replaces it with a heavy German book of materialist science. It's the famous text Stoff und Kraft, or Matter and Force by Buchner.
It is a devastating scene because Arkady doesn't even yell or argue. He just smiles with a sort of patronizing pity and walks away, carrying the Pushkin off.
We really need to translate the emotional stakes of this action for a modern listener. Today, swapping a poetry book for a science book doesn't seem like a big deal. But what is Arkady actually communicating to his father here?
Well, in the context of 1859, it is an act of profound intellectual condescension. Pushkin was the soul of Russian Romanticism, representing beauty, emotion, and art. Bruckner's Matter and Force was the trendy, atheistic, materialist text that argued that the universe is nothing but atoms and void, completely devoid of spirit or divine purpose.
Right.
By taking away the Pushkin and handing him the Pushner, Arkady is essentially telling his father, your entire worldview, your appreciation for beauty, your soul, it's all an embarrassing fairy tale. Here is the cold, hard math of reality. Educate yourself.
That is brutal, and Nikolai tries to read it. He sits there with this dense German science text. Later, he tells his brother Pavel, either I'm stupid or it's all nonsense. But he realizes that it doesn't matter if he understands the science or not. He understands the symbolic message loud and clear.
He does.
He tells Pavel, I begin to think. Our day is over. He realizes the world has moved past him. He says, you see now, our turn has come, and our successors can say to us, you are not of our generation, swallow your pill.
That is the tragedy of the older generation in this book. Turgenev does not paint them as evil villains. They are just obsolete. Their operating system is no longer supported.
Yeah.
But to truly understand why Pavel is so rigid and defensive with his English suits, and why Nikolai is so melancholy and yielding, we have to look at the very thing Bazarov despises most. We have to look at romantic love.
Because Bazarov views love purely as a biological function, right? He calls it an aesthetic disease. He argues with Arkady, saying, you study the anatomy of the eye, where does the enigmatical glance you talk about come in there? He thinks love is a delusion.
He does.
But for the older generation, love was the defining, catastrophic force of their lives.
Let's examine Pavel's backstory because it explains everything about his character. Why is he living in the middle of nowhere, polishing his nails and clinging to these rules?
Right.
Because in his youth, Pavel was a brilliant military officer in St. Petersburg. He had a limitless career ahead of him. He was desired by everyone. And then he meets Princess R.
The sources describe her as this enigmatic, complicated woman who lives a frenetic, glittering social life by day, but then weeps over a prayer book alone by night.
She is a deeply unstable, mesmerizing figure. And Pavel falls obsessively, agonizingly in love with her. They have an affair, but even when she surrenders to him physically, Pavel feels he can never truly reach her soul. She is always elusive.
It sounds incredibly toxic.
Oh, very much so.
And there's this profound symbol of their relationship. He gives her a ring with a sphinx carved into the stone. He tells her, that sphinx is you.
Yes.
When she eventually tires of him and flees abroad, Pavel throws his entire life away. He resigns his military commission. He spends 4 years wandering around Europe, basically stalking her, trying to win her back. It completely ruins him.
It does.
And years later, when he's living as an aging bachelor with his brother Nikolai, he receives a package. The princess has died insane in Paris, and in the package is the Sphinx ring he gave her. But she had drawn a cross over the Sphinx. She left a message saying that the cross is the solution to the enigma.
We have to unpack that symbolism because it's central to Turgenev's worldview. The Sphinx represents the mysterious, irrational, natural force of life and passionate love. It is a riddle that cannot be solved by logic.
Okay.
The cross represents suffering, duty, and ultimate resolution through faith and resignation. The princess is telling him that the frantic pursuit of romantic passion only leads to madness. The only peace is in accepting the heavy burden of the cross.
So Pavel staked his entire existence on a romantic ideal. He lost everything, and he became a hollow man. That's why he maintains his rigid external standards, his kid shoes, his collars, his strict adherence to aristocratic principles. His internal life was destroyed by love, so all he has left is the external armor.
Precisely. Now, contrast that grand European-style aristocratic tragic romance with his brother Nikolai's situation. Nikolai's first wife, Arkady's mother, whom he loved deeply and simply, died. Now, Nikolai is quietly living with a much younger woman named Fenichka.
And Fenichka's background is entirely different. She is the daughter of a former innkeeper who became Nikolai's housekeeper. She is shy, incredibly sweet, and she has just given birth to Nikolai's infant son, Mitya.
Fenichka is the embodiment of natural, unpretentious Russian life. She is terrified of the aristocratic Pavel, but she genuinely, simply loves Nikolai, and Nikolai loves her. But he is terribly embarrassed by the situation.
Totally.
When his progressive, university-educated son Arkady arrives, Nikolai actually stammers and blushes. He apologizes for having Fenichka in the main house, offering to hide her away in a lodge so as not to offend his son's sensibilities.
Wait, here's where it gets really interesting. Think about this. Nikolai's the one acting ashamed, but his love for Fenichka, a nobleman living with a commoner, having a child out of wedlock, is actually much more progressive and socially disruptive than Pavel's aristocratic posturing, and it's arguably more authentic than Arkady's textbook radicalism.
That is such a great point.
Nikolai is actively living the social disruption that the younger generation only talks about in their dorm rooms. Yet because his internal operating system is still running traditional morality, he feels ashamed around his emancipated son.
It's a brilliant psychological observation by Turgenev. And Arkady, in a rush of performative magnanimity, tells his father not to worry, acting so enlightened and superior about his father's little affair.
Oh, the arrogance.
Right. But Bazarov looks at the whole thing with absolute clinical detachment. He likes Fenichka well enough because she's a mother and she's natural. He views her almost like a healthy specimen of flora. But he mocks the romantic angst surrounding it. He thinks Pavel is an absolute fool for ruining his career over a woman, calling him not a man but a male.
Bazarov just eviscerates them. So at this point in the narrative, Bazarov seems to have completely won the intellectual high ground at the country estate. The fathers are retreating, confused, and melancholy. So Arkady and Bazarov decide to leave the country estate and head to the provincial town to observe society. But what they find in the town shows the darker, shallower side of Bazarov's progressive movement. And this is a dynamic that feels incredibly modern. Let's look at the performative progressives.
The young men travel to the provincial town of X, and they run into two characters who represent the absolute worst elements of the new generation. The first is a man named Sitnikov. He is the son of a wealthy gin merchant.
Okay.
Sitnikov is a sycophant. He considers himself a devoted disciple of Bazarov, but he has zero original thoughts. He just mimics Bazarov's rudeness and cynicism without possessing any of Bazarov's intellectual foundation.
Sitnikov is exactly the kind of guy who loudly proclaims that a whip is an excellent thing and screams, "Damn Macaulay," referring to the British historian just to sound edgy and radical. He's desperate for Bazarov's approval.
He really is.
And Sitnikov drags them to meet a woman named Madame Evdoksya Kukshin. She is an emancipated woman who has left her husband. She sits in an incredibly messy room, smoking cigarettes, drinking champagne at lunch, and relentlessly name-dropping progressive thinkers she clearly doesn't understand.
The scene at Kukshin's house is a masterpiece of satire. Turgenev describes the physical environment as chaotic and unappetizing. Kukshin casually dismisses the famous writer George Sand as retrograde, claims she is currently inventing a chemical composition to make dolls' heads unbreakable, and randomly asks Bazarov if he agrees with Proudhon's economic ideas without letting him answer.
Just nonstop.
Yeah, she flits from topic to topic with this nervous, aggressive energy.
Reading about Sitnikov and Kukshin genuinely felt like scrolling through the worst parts of social media today. They are the 19th century equivalent of reply guys or performative activists.
That's a great comparison.
You know exactly the type people who adopt the aesthetic, the trendy clothing, and the buzzwords of a radical movement entirely for social clout and vanity. They want to be seen as advanced, but they haven't done any of the intellectual heavy lifting. They're just wearing radicalism as a fashion statement to shock polite society.
That is a perfect modern translation. And Turgenev includes this satirical chapter to demonstrate a crucial historical truth: the inevitable dilution and vulgarization of a philosophy.
Right.
Bazarov is a genuine intellect. He arrived at his nihilism through intense study, through literal dissection, through biological science, and rigorous, albeit bleak, logic. But his followers, Sitnikov and Kukshin, are just adopting his conclusions because it's the trendy thing to do.
And what's amazing is that Bazarov completely despises them. He is physically disgusted by Kukshin, and he barely tolerates Sitnikov. There's this revealing moment later when Arkady asks Bazarov why he puts up with an idiot like Sitnikov.
Oh, yes.
And Bazarov's answer is incredibly cynical. He says, "Sitnikovs are indispensable to us. Do you understand? I need dolts like him. It's not for the gods to bake bricks, in fact."
It reveals the sheer elitism buried inside Bazarov's radicalism. He views himself as a god of the new era. He wants to tear down the aristocracy, but he has replaced it with an aristocracy of the intellect.
Right.
He needs these dolts, these performative trend followers, to do the dirty work of spreading the movement and tearing down the old society, while he remains above it all.
He considers himself entirely above the messy, foolish reality of human behavior. But his arrogance is about to hit a brick wall, because at the governor's ball in this provincial town, Bazarov spots a woman who does not fit into any of his neat biological categories.
That's right.
And this sets the stage for his ultimate unraveling. We meet the unmovable object.
Enter Anna Sergeyevna Odintsov. She is 29 years old, a wealthy widow, fiercely independent, and remarkably beautiful.
Yeah.
But what strikes both Arkady and Bazarov isn't just her looks, it's her presence.
Yeah.
Turgenev describes her as having a gracious and gentle force. She is completely tranquil. She doesn't posture like Kukshin. She doesn't fidget. She has achieved total control over her life.
Arkady is immediately smitten with her in a very traditional romantic way, but Bazarov reacts defensively. He instantly tries to objectify her to maintain his scientific distance. When Arkady asks what he thinks of her, Bazarov says, "What a magnificent body. Shouldn't I like to see it on the dissecting table?"
Yeah.
Okay, I have to react to that because that is a shocking, incredibly creepy thing to say. Is he just being a jerk to shock Arkady?
It's a defense mechanism. It's Bazarov desperately trying to force her into his biological worldview. He wants to reduce her to muscle, bone, and tissue. Because the alternative, the idea that she possesses a soul or a psychological complexity that can affect him emotionally is terrifying to his ideology.
Ah, I see.
If she's just biology, he can understand her and control his reaction to her.
But it doesn't work. His operating system is about to encounter a catastrophic error. Odintsov is intrigued by them, and she invites Arkady and Bazarov to her country estate, Nikolsko. And over the next 15 days, a subtle but profound shift happens.
It does.
Arkady, the romantic, actually ends up gravitating toward Odintsov's shy younger sister, Katya. They play the piano together, they look at nature. Meanwhile, Bazarov, the stone-cold nihilist, becomes increasingly obsessed with Anna Odintsov.
And we get to watch the real-time psychological breakdown of Bazarov. Turgenev writes that Bazarov begins to show signs of an unrest unprecedented in him. He can't sit still. He wanders the forest with long strides, smashing twigs, cursing himself.
He's losing it.
He catches himself having shameful romantic thoughts. He tries to suppress his blood. He tries to logic his way out of the adrenaline and dopamine rush he feels around her. But he realizes with absolute horror that he's experiencing the very lunacy he mocked Pavel for suffering.
Why does he fall apart so completely? Is it just that love is a biological reality that overrides his intellect?
That's exactly it. You cannot theorize away your humanity. As Bazarov's intellect is a fortress against societal rules, but love breaches the walls from the inside. His strict reliance on the scientific method fails to process the chemical reality of passion.
And Anna Odintsov is fascinated by him. She's not exactly swept away in love, but she's deeply curious. She is bored by her perfect life, and she forces him to open up. And this leads to the climactic nighttime conversation in her dimly lit study.
It is a masterclass in psychological tension. She tells him that she is unhappy because she has no passion for life. She says, "My idea is everything or nothing, a life for life. Takes mine, give up thine, or else better have nothing." She is daring him to step into the abyss of true feeling.
And Bazarov is pushed to the brink the next day. He cannot hold it in anymore. He corners her, he confesses his love, but he doesn't do it like a suave romantic hero.
No, not at all.
He does it, as he admits, like a fool, like a madman. He physically rushes at her. The text says it was a passion not unlike hatred and perhaps akin to it. He wants to consume her. It's violent and desperate.
And how does she react to this raw, terrifying display of emotion? She repulses him. She frees herself from his embrace and retreats to the corner of the room. And later, alone in her thoughts, she considers the possibility of a life with him. But she concludes, no. God knows what it would lead to. He couldn't be played with. Peace is anyway the best thing in the world.
Peace is anyway the best thing in the world. Why does she reject him? Does she feel nothing for him?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, she rejects him because of self-preservation. Anna Odintsov is a woman who fought hard to achieve her independence in her perfectly ordered, luxurious life. She was intrigued by the raw power and the chaos that Bazarov represents. He offered a glimpse of intense, burning life.
Right.
But when confronted with the actual physical reality of his animalistic passion, she pulls back. She chooses the safety of her highly ordered, predictable life over the chaos of true passion. She looks over the edge into the abyss and decides to stay in her comfortable armchair.
So Bazarov is shattered. His ideology offered him no tools to deal with a broken heart. He has nothing left. He flees to his parents' house in a state of despair. Arkady, realizing he truly loves the younger sister Katya, also prepares to leave his mentor behind.
Yeah.
The new man is defeated not by a debate, not by the aristocracy, but by his own biology. And the text leaves us reeling. The ideology is bruised. And as it turns out, the public reaction when this book was published in 1862 was exactly the same. They were reeling too. Which brings us to the critical storm.
The reception of Fathers and Sons was unlike almost anything in literary history. The critical essays we are looking at by Maurice Baring, Richard Curl, and Woloszewski outline a violent cultural storm. Now, in Europe, the book was hailed as a masterpiece. Flaubert, George Sand, Tainfurt, they all thought it was a triumph of art, a beautiful window into the Russian soul.
Right, but in Russia, it was a disaster for Turgenev personally. Now, I want to be clear here, as we report on this, we are absolutely not taking a side on the political spectrum today.
No, of course not.
We are simply reporting on the historical reality of the text's reception, as Turgenev's work touched on highly charged left-wing and right-wing political nerves of the 1860s. What's fascinating is how this book acted as a Rorschach test for the political extremes of that era. The revolutionaries saw one thing, while the reactionaries saw something completely different, and both sides were furious.
Turgenev managed to anger absolutely everyone. The revolutionary left, the young radicals, who actually were the Bizarovs of their day, thought the character was a vicious caricature, a libel against their movement.
They felt attacked.
They did. They thought Turgenev was mocking them by showing Bizarov failing at love and associating with fools like Sitnikov. They accused Turgenev of siding with the fathers.
And the reactionary right, the conservative, older generation, the Pavels of the world, they thought the book was a scandalous glorification of nihilism. They thought Bizarov was presented as a hero, a Luciferian figure, and they accused Turgenev of bowing down to the radical youth and glorifying the devil.
Yeah.
They accused him of siding with the children.
Maurice Baring captures this dynamic perfectly in his essay. He notes that in highly polarized times, anyone who tries to draw an impartial, nuanced portrait of a radical figure is viewed as an enemy by both sides.
That sounds very familiar.
Very. The conflicting elements of Russian society were so terribly in earnest about fighting their cause that if you weren't 100% with them, you were the enemy. Because Turgenev refused to make Bazarov purely a flawless hero or purely an evil villain, society didn't know what to do with him.
So what does this all mean? It means Turgenev's greatest crime in the eyes of his contemporaries was his honesty. He showed the uncomfortable truth that a radical could be brilliant, entirely right about the hypocrisy of the old guard, and possess a giant intellect, while simultaneously being arrogant, emotionally stunted, and ultimately a victim of his own flawed humanity.
Exactly.
He painted a human being, not a political poster, and people absolutely hate that when they are desperately looking for a poster to rally behind.
Richard Curl writes beautifully on this point. He says that Bazarov is a man of astonishing intellect. He is the pawn of an emotion he despises. He is a man of gigantic will. He can do nothing but destroy his own beliefs. It is a hopeless fight of mind against instinct.
We've covered incredible ground today. We've explored the origins of the nihilist, the historical powder keg of 1850s Russia, and that carriage ride that brought the New World to the old estate.
Yeah.
We've watched the clash between generations, between Pavel's aristocratic, tragic traditions and Bazarov's ruthless science. We analyzed the performative trend followers like Sitnikov and Kukshin, and we watched the ultimate triumph of human emotion over cold logic when Bazarov shattered against the unmovable Madame Odintsov.
And the reason we do these deep dives into the sources is because these debates, the arguments between Pavel and Bazarov over tradition versus disruption, art versus science, meaning versus utility, they aren't confined to 1859. The language changes, the hashtags change, but the human blueprint remains exactly the same.
Which brings us back to that blueprint of generational rage we talked about at the very beginning.
Yeah.
If you strip away the 19th century setting, you see the eternal cycle. Turgenev showed us that the children will always eventually rebel against the fathers with new, radical, disruptive ideas. It is the engine of history.
It really is.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. If that cycle is inevitable, take a hard look at your own deeply held beliefs today. The ideas you think are the most cutting edge, the most progressive, the most fundamentally right and modern.
Yeah.
What is the nihilism of tomorrow that the next generation will use to tear your beliefs down? Are you prepared for the day when someone, maybe your own child, walks up to you, gently takes your favorite book out of your hands, replaces it with something you cannot begin to understand, and you realize with a cold dread that your day is over? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. We wish you well until our next exploration.